job seekers headed for the centers of transportation and industry. California alone saw its population grow by nearly 2 million. Boom towns like Los Angeles, Seattle, Baton Rouge, and Detroit attracted hundreds of thousands of would-be workers. 70,000 people poured into Washington, D.C. in the first year after Pearl Harbor to administer new agencies created. During World War II, big government became a permanent fixture of American life. Back in 1938, Roosevelt had called the South the nation's #1 economic problem. FDR used the war to accelerate the region's economic development. The states of the old Confederacy received a disproportionate share of defense contracts, including nearly $6 billion of federally financed industrial facilities. No group was more affected by the war than Southern blacks. 750,000 left their farms for jobs in southern cities. Renewing the great outward migration of World War I, 1.5 million left their homes to seek employment in the war plants of the West and North. The war also revitalized African Americans' struggle for racial equality. How, they asked, could America fight a war in the name of freedom and democracy, while at home it still discriminated against African Americans and other minorities?
One of the real problems that Americans had in fighting the war was that they were fighting the Nazis, a racist government which was well known for its horrendous racial policies. The American racial policies are not all that good either, because Americans have a racially segregated society. And it's very, very hard to maintain the racial segregation in the United States when you're being pressed to fight an enemy who is known for his racism. So what the war does is put pressure on the ancient bad racial attitudes of white America. And it ultimately leads to the desegregation of the armed forces, and I think ultimately to the civil rights movement.
In 1941, to protest discrimination in the nation's war industries, labor leader A. Philip Randolph threatened to march 100,000 blacks on Washington, D.C. To prevent this, FDR issued an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which outlawed racial discrimination in America's defense industries. African Americans would make significant economic gains during the war, moving up the occupational ladder into skilled jobs previously reserved for whites only. But their advances did not take place without conflict. The movement of minorities into the nation's cities increased long-standing racial tensions. In 1943 alone, 250 racial conflicts exploded in 47 different cities. In Detroit, 30 hours of rioting left 34 people dead and property damage in excess of $2 million.
A number of Native American Indians served in the Army, and some of them were in famous units. There was a famous Navajo unit that used their native language to fool the enemy, because instead of using code, they talked in their native language, and the Japanese could never figure out what they were doing, and so never broke their Navajo language. In other cases, Native Americans were used as scouts.
During the emergencies and crises of war, a nation may take steps that it will later regret. Fearing a Japanese invasion and sabotage of its West Coast war plants, the federal government rounded up about 120,000 Japanese Americans and placed them in internment camps in isolated regions of the West. There they lived behind barbed wire under armed guards for the duration of the war. 2/3 of these people were native-born U.S. citizens, and many lost everything they owned when they were taken from their homes. Japanese Americans faced an uphill battle in convincing the nation of their patriotism. To prove their patriotism, over 8,000 evacuees worked on Western farms. The 442nd Nisei Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese-American volunteers from both Hawaii and the internment camps, would become the most highly decorated unit in the history of the U.S. Army for its bravery on the battlefields of Europe. At a meeting at Tehran, Iran, in late 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill promised Stalin they would open a second front in Europe by the following summer. After beating the Germans and Italians in North Africa, the Allies jumped across the Mediterranean to Italy, where they stood firm in the face of fierce German resistance. While the Soviet Army engaged the bulk of the German army on the Eastern Front, the Allies prepared the invasion of France. June 6, 1944, D-Day. A combined force of American, English, Canadian, and Free French troops invade France in the largest amphibious assault in world history. 4,000 transports, escorted by 600 ships, sailed across the English Channel and landed 175,000 men on the beaches of Normandy. In retaliation, Germany rained V-1 flying bombs on London. In the months following the Normandy invasion, the Allies converged on Germany. In one last desperate counterattack, German troops drove back the Allied troops during the cold winter of 1944 in the Battle of the Bulge. But in the end, the Allied lines held and soon renewed their drive into the heart of the Third Reich. As Allies fought their way into German-held territory, they liberated Nazi-run concentration camps. At some, the air was still filled with the smell of burning flesh, the end of the process that exterminated close to 6 million Jews and millions of Poles, Gypsies, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and other groups the Nazis deemed undesirable.
President Roosevelt is dead.
On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died.
There is the flag-draped coffin resting on this black caisson.
Days later, angry Italians killed fascist leader Mussolini. As Soviet troops stormed into Berlin on April 30th, Adolf Hitler took his own life. 7 days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, the United States had kept Japan at bay until the defeat of Hitler and Mussolini. The war in the Pacific had been sweaty, grimy, bloody, and vicious. In 1942, the Japanese had swept through the British colonies in Asia and threatened to invade India. American General Douglas MacArthur led a fierce American defense of the Philippines, but the Japanese trapped the Americans in the narrow Bataan Peninsula and forced them to surrender. As MacArthur left, he vowed, "I shall return." Thousands of Americans and Filipino troops died in the terrible death march from Bataan to prison camps in the north of the islands. Once there, thousands more would die as well.
What?
Intent on destroying the American Pacific Fleet, the Japanese steamed toward Midway Island, where the American fleet intercepted and defeated them in the first battle fought entirely by planes from aircraft carriers. The two fleets never saw each other. After the battle at Midway, the United States began the long, slow process of attacking Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. It was known as island hopping. They began with Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, where the Japanese kept up fanatical resistance for 6 months before finally giving in. It cost tens of thousands of U.S. lives to take the Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Capturing the one small island of Okinawa in June 1945 cost 12,500 U.S. lives. in a battle that was supposed to take 45 days, but lasted 80. As U.S. forces advanced toward Japan, a small group of scientists working in secret were about to change the course of world history. Out in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Robert Oppenheimer was heading the top-secret Manhattan Project to develop an atomic bomb before the Germans. In July 1945, new President Truman met with Stalin and British leaders at the Potsdam Conference, held near Berlin. There, Truman learned that American scientists had successfully exploded an atomic device in the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico. President Truman now had to decide whether this awesome new weapon should be used. Truman created a special committee of high-level policymakers to consider the options. It recommended unanimously that the bomb be dropped. A number of scientists disagreed. But after a second scientific committee recommended that the bomb be used, the president made his decision. On July 25, 1945, President Truman authorized the only use of nuclear weapons in world history. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the superfortress Enola Gay dropped the first bomb on the city of Hiroshima. When it landed a fireball millions of degrees at its center, it erased 4 square miles of city. In 9 seconds, it killed at least 70,000 people and destroyed 62,000 buildings. The mushroom cloud from the explosion rose 40,000 feet into the air. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing 40,000 people instantly. The Emperor of Japan announced the nation would surrender on August 14th. It became known as VJ Day, for Victory over Japan. 2 million people surged into New York City's Times Square to rejoice. All across the United States, streets were jammed with crying, laughing, and shouting people. Many people ducked into churches to say a prayer of thanks. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese formally surrendered on the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
The Second World War had cost the lives of more than 262,000 Americans. More than 670,000 had been wounded, and countless others emotionally scarred. Demobilization of U.S. forces brought millions of changed men and women home to an equally changed society. The war had accelerated the movement towards bigness, the government, the economy, and the military. In the decades following the end of the Second World War, the United States would experience unprecedented prosperity and would emerge as the leader of the Western world. Despite such power, many Americans remained uneasy. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and its apparent desire to expand its influence into Asia and other parts of the globe concerned U.S. policymakers. In response to the Soviet threat, the United States would maintain and then expand its military presence abroad, assuming the mantle of the protector of the free world.